This video will begin our discussion on dissociative disorders. What you have before you is the PowerPoint from our gray textbook about dissociative disorders, and as you can see, it is Chapter 9. You can also follow along in the DSM-5, starting on page 291. Yes, 291. Of course, the PowerPoint goes through all the extra information that Gray has as well, but we'll also be looking at the diagnostic criteria straight from the DSM, because if you remember, the Gray PowerPoints kind of summarize a little bit and use more textbook language than the clinical DSM-5 language. So it may be helpful to have both this video and the DSM-5 handy while you're doing some studying. Okay, so let's talk about dissociative disorders and their spirit, because that's a common discussion that we have in this course, the spirit of the disorders. So the dissociative disorders, as Gray says in the first paragraph on the PowerPoint, are characterized by a disruption of and or discontinuity in the normal integration of consciousness, memory, identity, emotion, perception, body representation, motor control, and behavior. So that's a long-winded way of saying that in dissociative disorders, the key symptom of the spirit of the whole section is that there's some sort of disruption in a person's cognitive functioning. And when we think of cognitive functioning, we think of thinking patterns, memory, and then if you think about, what organs are used for cognitive functioning, we think of the brain, of course. And what does the brain control? Well, the brain controls just about everything. Motor control, behavior, body representation, perception, all of those things that are listed here. So all of these big terms are basically here to tell us that in dissociative disorders, when someone dissociates, they have some sort of disruption of their cognitive functioning or a discontinuity in their cognitive functioning. Okay, so that is the overall theme of the category. So all of the disorders in this section are going to have some sort of issue with a disruption in cognitive functioning. Okay, so technically, many of the disorders in the DSM could have the same theme. There are several disorders out there that have some sort of disruption in cognitive functioning. The trauma disorders, the obsessive compulsive disorders, all of those have disruptions in cognitive functioning. So what makes dissociative disorders special or unique compared to all the others? Well, that first bullet says that the dissociative experiences seem to be triggered by unexpected trauma or severe emotional threats. That's the key to dissociative disorders. These disruptions in cognitive functioning are most of the time triggered by some sort of trauma. So basically what this means is when a client is presented with a trauma or some sort of severe emotional threat, the client almost shuts down and runs on autopilot. So it's kind of like the brain takes over and says, listen, this is a very traumatic situation. This is a scary time. So I'm just going to put you in a timeout and I'm going to take over and I'm going to handle things and you're not even going to know what's going on. And as soon as it's safe, I'll bring you back and you can take over. So it's like the brain kind of puts the body on autopilot, takes over, handles things. The client is still functioning, and functioning might be a bad word. The client is still going through the motions and actually experiencing what's going on. But afterwards, the client's not going to remember because technically the brain was on autopilot doing all the work, and the client came back to consciousness out of their timeout after the threat was over. So then the client has trouble recalling what happened during the trauma or during the severe emotional threat. We'll give lots of examples as we talk about the specific disorders, but that's the overall thing. So when you think about that phenomenon of dissociating, it's easy to think about some of the things that would cause someone to dissociate. An unexpected trauma, severe emotional threat. We can come up with several examples for those. But one additional piece of information that I like that Gray gives is the second bullet. She says that there are several variables that are related to a person's vulnerability to a dissociative disorder. And she lists three types of variables that are characteristics of a person that would make them more vulnerable or susceptible to reacting to a trauma in a dissociative way instead of a more resilient and functioning way. So, let's talk about some of the factors that would cause, or not really cause, but would that are correlated with someone who might react to a trauma by dissociating versus someone who would react to a trauma in a more resilient and positive way. So, someone who's experienced a childhood trauma is more likely to dissociate during a traumatic experience versus be resilient. Um, so, when we think about childhood trauma, the first thing that I think of, and probably because I worked in the children's home for a long time, is a child who has been abused or neglected, seen domestic violence, um, um, been around substance use by parents, um, sexual abuse, those types of things. But there are other traumas as well. It doesn't, those are what we think of immediately when we hear childhood trauma, but we're talking about any trauma in childhood. So this could be someone who witnessed a murder. This could be someone who was hit by a car. Any kind of trauma, someone who experienced an armed robbery or a burglary in their home. Even maybe they were in a tornado. Any kind of trauma. Uh, Anyone that's experienced a childhood trauma is more likely to, or not, how can I phrase that? Those, when we're thinking about what types of characteristics are related to dissociation, childhood trauma is one of those correlating factors. So when we looked at people who have experienced a dissociative disorder, one of the things that a lot of those people had in common was they had experienced childhood trauma. Now, that's not saying that every person who has experienced childhood trauma is more likely to dissociate than not. What this is saying is those who have experienced dissociative disorders, commonly that group of people have experienced childhood trauma. And I hope you see the difference. If not, we can talk about it. All right, so that makes sense. If we think about the experience of a childhood trauma, it would make sense that dissociation is a common experience for those clients because in childhood, when a client experiences a trauma, they have a very limited amount of tools in their toolbox to use as coping skills for this traumatic event. Also, in childhood, a child's brain is not developed fully. So it's hard to expect that child to be able to bounce back in a super resilient way to a severe trauma when they don't have the tools they need. They haven't learned that yet, and their brain is not fully developed. So a lot of times, when the brain is not fully developed, the brain might step in and say, okay, you don't have what you need to deal with this trauma right now, so I'm going to step in and take care of it for you and bring you back when it's safe. So, a lot of kids that have repressed memories, um, they don't remember much from childhood because of all the traumatic experiences, have likely dissociated in order to avoid experiencing the trauma and reliving the trauma. All right, the second arrow there says suggestibility. Someone who is highly suggestible is more likely to dissociate than someone who is not. So, um, when we think about what suggestibility means, we mean those who are easily talked into things that may not have been their idea or may not be something that they wanted to do. Populations that have um, suggestibility as a common characteristic or symptom would be clients that are lower functioning cognitively. Um, and there's another population, but we'll have to come back to that. I can't think of that right now. We're kind of running low on time. So lower cognitive functioning, children, of course, are highly suggestible. It's going to bother me, but I'll think of it and probably just shout it out randomly a few slides down. And then biological factors, we're talking about genetics. Sometimes dissociation is kind of an easy coping skill. And sometimes when we see that modeled to us, sometimes that happens as well. So biological factors, such as, those genetic factors, um, lead toward dissociation. Also, it's more common in women than men. So that's a biological factor as well. Okay, so the next slide talks about the key aspects of the dissociative disorders. So, what are some terms that you're going to see throughout these diagnoses? The first one is amnesia, and I think that you probably already know the definition of amnesia, but basically, we're talking about when someone loses their memory um, of their own self, or they lose memory regarding a period of specific time in that person's past. Um, so it's forgetting, and it's not forgetfulness. It's the act of forgetting chunks of time or memories of a person's identity. And it says here that it's more than simple forgetfulness, such as where your car is parked, where you put your keys, that kind of thing. Um, it, Amnesia is losing chunks of time or memory about your own history, your own identity, things that you should know very easily. Um, Also, with amnesia in the dissociative disorder category, we need to make sure that we're only thinking about amnesia due to a trauma and not a physical biological trauma. We're talking about a mental health trauma. So if a person has amnesia because they got a concussion and there's some sort of traumatic brain injury, that's not amnesia that we're talking about. If someone has amnesia because of some sort of dementia related issue, that's not the amnesia we're talking about with dissociative disorders. This type of amnesia, we're talking about someone who's experienced a trauma, their brain has gone on autopilot, and the client has been put in timeout until the trauma is over. And during that chunk of time when the brain was on autopilot, the client can't recall that period of time. Okay, depersonalization is feeling detached from oneself or as an outside observer of one's own self. So with depersonalization, the client actually feels like they are not attached to their body anymore. In some cases, clients have reported that they experience feeling as though they're hovering over themselves, kind of watching themselves go through the day and go through the motions of their life. It's like they're not in control of themselves anymore. It's kind of hard to explain, but we'll talk about it when we get to that disorder. Derealization is sensing that objects in one's world are strange, unreal, or have suddenly changed dimension, appearance, or location. This is when the client's environment that they're used to suddenly feels foreign. And the example there it gives is when a person's own home feels unfamiliar. So when a client feels like they just don't feel comfortable or that they belong in the area where they normally feel comfortable. It can be as simple as that, or it could be as severe as when a client does go home, they don't recognize anything. Identity confusion, that is self explanatory, being unsure of your own identity or who you are, not knowing your name, not knowing where you live, where you come from, not knowing if you have children or not, just not remembering any characteristic about you. And then identity alteration, behaving in a way that suggests one has assumed a new identity, and you can probably guess where that's going. We see that a lot we see that mostly in dissociative identity disorder that used to be called multiple personality disorder. Okay, and the last slide before we start talking about some of the disorders in the dissociative disorder category is a brief little discussion about how culture, the client's culture, plays a role in diagnosing dissociative disorders. Um, the first bullet says that it's important that we recognize or assess the importance of difference in shaping the person's experiences when assessing for pathology associated with dissociation. Um, the client's behavior might seem strange to us, but in the person's culture, it might not seem as strange. For example, um, it's popular in Eastern Kentucky. It may be popular other places, but I have family members who kind of operate under the philosophy of if you don't talk about it or recognize it, it doesn't exist. So if there's some sort of bad decision a client made in their past or a traumatic experience they experienced, if you don't talk about it and bring it out in the open, then it never happened. And eventually you kind of forget that it happened. So the client might, it shows up a lot in family counseling where, one sibling might have held a grudge against the other sibling for something that sibling did when she was 12 years old, but because it was something that the client sibling did that was bad, the client sibling doesn't remember it, can't recall it, because they've kind of repressed it and put it out of their mind. In some cultures, repression is the go-to coping skill. So if that's the case, we might not call the act of repression as dissociation. So you might have to spend some time evaluating the client's culture to see if this act of dissociating is actually a normal thing within the client's culture. The second bullet, dissociative experiences like trance-like states, speaking in tongues, spirit possessions are sometimes accepted in cultures. Um, Again, in Eastern Kentucky, we have a lot of um, uh, Pentecostal churches who um, speak in tongues on a regular basis. And while those are kind of dissociative experiences where there's a discontinuity in cognitive functioning, to an outsider, that may look like a dissociation, and technically it is by definition, but it's not a dissociation by definition of a dissociative disorder. So while it is a dissociative experience, it's not one that would meet the criteria for a dissociative disorder. Um, Especially because if we think about the spirit of all mental health disorders is it's not a disorder if it's common within the person's culture. Okay, so then the last bullet says that anytime we make an assessment about the client's dissociations, we have to first think about the person's cultural identity. Again, if they're speaking in tongues and living in New York City and with no religious affiliation, that might lead to some sort of dissociative disorder diagnosis. But if the person's cultural identity is they live in Eastern Kentucky and are Pentecostal, then we probably couldn't justify diagnosing a dissociative disorder. You have to think about the client's cultural and psychosocial environment and the cultural aspects of the relationship between the individual and the practitioner. So, looking at the cultural differences between the client and the counselor is important to making sure that we understand the client from where they're coming from and not just where we're expecting they come from. Okay, so I think that's enough time for one video. So we'll call that our introduction, and then we will start the next video talking about dissociative amnesia.